3, 2, 1, go.
Hello and welcome to Writer Mother Monster. I'm your host, Lara Ehrlich, and our guest tonight is Rosanna Warren. Before I introduce Rosanna, thank you all for tuning in, and you can now listen to Writer Mother Monster as a podcast on all major audio platforms or read the interview transcript on writermothermonster.com. If you enjoyed the episode, as always, please consider becoming a patron or patroness on Patreon to help make this series possible. Please also chat with Rosanna and me during the interview. Your comments and questions will appear in our broadcast studio, and we'll weave them into the conversation. And now I'm excited to introduce Rosanna. Rosanna Warren has been publishing poems of riveting, compassionate darkness and social conscience for nearly 40 years, says the LA Review of Books. Her most recent book of poems is So Forth, and she is the recipient of awards from the Academy of American Poets, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Lila Wallace Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the New England Poetry Club, among many others. And she was a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. She teaches at the University of Chicago and taught at Boston University, where I first met Rosanna in a class called Eccentric Moderns, which we'll talk about. It is not hyperbole to say that Rosanna was one of the best professors I ever had, and I'm not saying that just because she agreed to come on the show with me today. She also has 2 daughters, ages 37 and 35, and 2 grandchildren, a boy and a girl, ages 6 and 3. She describes writer motherhood in 3 words as frazzled, passionate, surprised. Welcome, Rosanna.
Well, thank you, Lara, so much. And it is really lovely to rediscover you so many years after we were reading Hart Crane together.
I know, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on with me today. And I was telling you before the show that there were many others who were in classes with you at BU and elsewhere, of course, but people who I knew from BU who are very excited that you'll be on the show with me tonight. So hello to all of you as well, uni friends. Excited to have you, and please comment and chat with us in the comments tonight. So, Rosanna, we didn't actually talk about when you wanted to do this, but I'd love for you to read the poem that you came prepared to share with us, if you're ready now, or we could wait a little later.
I have it here at my fingertips, and
okay.
This is a poem to one of my daughters, so it seemed like an appropriate offering for this evening. And this daughter, whose name is Chiara, is a psychiatric social worker, and she works with very, very needy people. For Chiara, leaves crackle beneath our feet, tinder, kindling, as we walk by the brook, the crabapple tree, a crimson pointy-east nimbus. You want to hold each wounded soul in your hands. Autumn flares, the damaged, the human berserk find their way to you. I don't know how you sleep. In the Gorgon's blood, one drop is poison, the other heals. Fevered autumn, autumn I adore, croons an old song. We stroll the road, scuffing dust, and come upon a garter snake lying motionless, its tail, we guess, nicked by a passing car. When we nudge it, it flips to its back in an agonized S, squirms, but can't advance. Its belly gleams. We edge it into the grass. Do we stop seeing when we walk away? The brook prattles on, homes far off. Dusk settles slowly among leaves. That's not mercy scattering from its hands. Thank you.
Thank you. That was just as powerful as I remember your poetry and your presence as being. So thank you. Tell us a little bit more. Let's start with that poem. Tell me a bit more about it and why it is dedicated to your daughter, titled after your daughter.
Yes. This poem became very important to me for the line, the two half lines. Do we stop seeing when we walk away? It just seems to me a fundamental ethical question in life about how we acknowledge the suffering of others, whether we can acknowledge the suffering of others, and to what extent we just, to preserve ourselves, maybe just walk away, don't want to see. And I can't speak for other people. I know that for myself, there are times when I say the story's unbearable. I can't read this article anymore. I can't solve everybody's hunger in the world. And yet there's the impulse that we should care for each other. And my daughter, who works with severely suffering people, does a kind of job I could not do, of the stress level of trying to manage caring for people who are desperately needy, and day in, day out. And somehow people who do that kind of therapy and caring must develop, I think, a really extraordinary spiritual strength and psychological strength to be able to hold that suffering and continue their lives and try to help people. But I guess we all in some way figure out our own balance and our own way to try to acknowledge the suffering, or at least acknowledge that we're not acknowledging it.
Yeah. You know what I wish I had done before this interview was revisit the notes from the class I took with you, because I still have them all somewhere in the house.
Yeah.
But I remember, and you're sort of bringing back memories of that class, because we talked about this type of issue. So we looked at lines within poems, we looked at words, but we also talked about these big philosophical concerns of humanity and how there's the poet's responsibility to address them. That's something I really took away from your class. Can you talk about those two lines in the context of poetry and the importance of poetry, and why put them on paper? Why speak them?
Why put poems on paper?
No.
Yeah.
We'll get to that. Maybe that's another question.
Right.
Why the two lines that you picked out?
Do we stop seeing when we walk away? This poem is, in a way, pretty simple. It's an anecdote of a mother, or we don't know it's a mother in the poem. It's an I speaking to a you, taking a walk, finding a wounded snake, and in a sense, not doing the merciful thing. I think if I'd been courageous, I would have probably killed this snake, put it out of its misery, and I just couldn't do it. It was cowardice. I just couldn't. So we just got it off the road, which was, in a sense, the cowardly thing to do. Though I'm not a vet, maybe some vet could have saved it, but we were in the wilds of Vermont and there was no vet around. Anyway, it was a morally troubling scene and painful. I mean, just painful to see another creature's pain, and to feel implicated. So I try not to write poems that explain themselves too much. I try to have the poem be suggestive, to have the objects and actions and colors in the poem do the work for the imagination. But in this case, I allowed myself to be extremely brutally direct. Do we stop seeing when we walk away? And I'm okay with that, of allowing sometimes poems to speak very directly if it's not too crude. And I hoped the scene around it would make it complex enough. I think I would like poems to be unsettling in different ways, and for occasionally a line to feel even like a knife stab.
Yeah. And grapple with these big concerns about morality and violence and our moral imperative. So Yeah, definitely.
I chose
has
this poem. Oh, sorry, I was going to say I chose this poem when you invited me to be on this fascinating podcast. The theme really, it's something that anybody who's a parent has lived, because motherhood seems to me so profoundly about caring,
Mhm.
And a deep lesson in caring.
Yeah, let's talk more about that. I was going to ask you if your daughter had read this poem. I'm sure she has, or heard
Yes.
you recite it. Does she recall that that moment, or
Oh, yes.
what does she have to say about this poem?
Um, uh, well, I think she thought that it wasn't an invasion of her privacy. I try to be really careful with my friends and family members about my poetry. Some poets take a few more liberties than I do with other people's private lives. I tried to set some boundaries, and I know my children would like me to set some boundaries.
Yeah.
But she seemed to have forgiven me for this poem, or I didn't.
Oh, sure.
I don't think she thought I really needed forgiveness for this poem.
I wouldn't think so, but I'm sure everyone has.
We both cared about the snake. And we were both upset by the snake.
Absolutely. Yeah, so let's shift to motherhood for a second and talk about your children. So you have two girls, both in their mid-30s now, and two grandkids. But let's back way up, even before I knew you at BU, when we realized that your kids at that time were teenagers, which was horrifying to me that was
Yes.
20 years ago. But tell me a little bit about new motherhood. Did you always want to have children? Or, yeah, I'll just stop there. Did you always want children?
That's really interesting. No, I didn't. I wanted, when I was a young person, that is in a sense from childhood through my adolescence, I wanted to be a painter. I saw myself as an artist. I worked really hard at it. I was drawing from the age of 3. I went to art schools. I was also writing, but that was private. And I didn't see myself in a conventional family at all. And I also was uncomfortable with the role of being a, quote, girl in high school. It was unbearable. Those awful dances. I just thought the whole thing was so awful.
I'm with you there. Yeah, that was truly terrible.
and, and then you bumble your way into adulthood, and you fall in love with a few people, and you sort of try to get the hang of it. First, these romance stuff, when I was a teenager, it struck me like a Halloween party. You had to play girl and put on some makeup, and oh God, thank God that's over. But then falling in love with somebody enough so that you could imagine having a life together, which happened. And then children emerged from that loving, and it just seemed so natural and beautiful. And I never resented it. I just thought it was this tremendous gift, and all the more maybe tremendous because I hadn't imagined it for myself.
Yeah. I understand that. I didn't either. And then, like you, it was meeting a person who then suddenly it was like, well, that just makes sense that I would want to have a family with this person. But without the person there, it was just me kind of envisioning my own trajectory solo. And so it was the other person being added in that changed it. Tell me a little bit more. Let's go back and then we'll move forward again. But let's go back to your early life, because I know that you grew up in a very artistic, very literary family. How did that shape you and your expectations for yourself as a writer? And we sort of talked about the mother piece that we'll add back in.
Yes, well, I suppose it was a piece of luck, and in some ways not luck, to grow up in a family of writers. My mother and father were both well-known writers, and so in a way that was mostly great, that I had a model of living that way. And they were very disciplined. They were writing the study doors shut at 9 a.m. They didn't open the door until 2 p.m. If you had, my brother and I we were often in remote places in the country during the summer. We just knew that unless we had broken our leg, we were not allowed to bother our parents. So we had to figure out our own games and wander around, play, which we did. It was a very good model of discipline, and a world where practicing an art was considered natural and not goofy. The difficulty of it was that it wasn't that our parents thought we should be artists. In fact, they sort of advised us against it. But but when my brother became a sculptor, and I started writing more than I was painting in my very early 20s, and so I had to deal with the you might say social expectations of outsiders looking at me and thinking at times, well, she's just riding on her parents' reputation. So in order to be a writer, in order to have the courage to go on and keep writing and publishing, I just had to ignore all that and just follow the drive that I had to make these things in words. So it was such a strong inner drive. I really wanted to be a painter. I tried to suppress the words. I just couldn't suppress them.
Tell me about that. And I have so many questions to go back to here, but let's stick with that for a second. What was the drive to paint, and why suppress the urge or the desire to write?
I can't explain the drive to paint, but from the age of 3, I was drawing, and I was good at it. I think I can modestly say, and I drew and painted all through my childhood and youth, and was encouraged. Also, I was born in 1953, so the television existed, but my family didn't own a television. We lived in a weird, almost 19th century life without television. So when at school, I didn't understand what the other kids were talking about, because they were talking about TV shows I'd never seen. So I was painting and drawing and writing and playing games with my brother, and and some friends who would come over, and anyway, just being a kid running around the woods. So I can't tell you where the drawing came from, but it was so deeply part of what I was doing. When I went to Yale, it was a very fine art school, and I had marvelous painting teachers. And then I went to the Skowhegan, which is a wonderful summer program for ambitious young artists, and the New York Studio School. So I was really that was how I saw my life, and I was absolutely passionate about it. But I found the writing really did keep clawing at me, and there were things I couldn't get into the paintings. Things like saying, "Do we stop seeing when we walk away?" I couldn't get that into a painting.
Yeah,
and that drama. So gradually, the writing took over the painting. It took me a few years. It was like a love affair, gradually dwindling and painful. And when I realized when I was about 24, I realized I wasn't painting enough to be a painter. That was painful.
I'm sure. Yeah.
But I still
the commitment.
Draw. Yeah. I draw privately. I draw because it's a way of orienting myself in reality. And it's just a form of meditation. It's not to show people.
I love that. And I think others have that feeling about writing, right? Like writing in journals and so on for self-expression with no urge to show others. I don't understand. Even when I'm writing in a journal, I'm like, someday someone will read this as part of my archives. So it's like, I never quite have the sense that I'm writing for myself, and I wonder what that would be like. But so I love the idea of drawing for yourself. I have a comment here from Nicole Gleissner, who you probably remember from uni.
Yes.
And she says she's excited to be part of the uni Rosanna Warren fan club, but she also noted here something I wanted to go back to as well. So I think going back to your parents shutting their office doors, I've heard this described as benign neglect, and I think it can be really freeing for parent artists to cultivate this freedom. I definitely agree. And it's something I've heard a lot of the writer mothers talk about on this show is the some are very comfortable closing the door, and others are struggling with the guilt involved in closing the door to their children. And it sounds like you and your brother maybe were able to play and to find some freedom there. But was there also any resentment on the part of you and your brother toward your parents for closing the door? And how did that carry through to your practice?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't remember feeling any resentment myself as a child with my parents closing the door. It was just understood that was the way things were. And they were very loving when they were with us. They were really with us, playing games and whatever, including us. But I know my own children missed me at times, and it was hard for them and hard for me, especially when they were little. They remember that my daughters have told me, Mom, when you shut the door and I was crying on the other side, oh my God, those were awful. I didn't stay in the study when they left child weeping on the other side of the door, but there were tensions, which I think is partly why maybe you have this show, which is that this is not easy being a mother and a writer or any kind of artist or professional person.
Yeah,
there
all
are
of
tensions.
those.
There are costs.
Yeah, definitely. What was your logistical practice when you had young kids? And then, we can talk about as they got older, but were you able to close the door most of the time if they weren't weeping on the other side? And sort of how did you balance that? How did you balance your kids and the time that you needed for devoted work?
I think balance might be an overstatement.
Yeah. I think so too.
I remember more as a kind of delirium or something. Because I was teaching full time too, as you remember. So staying up very late to 1 or 2 in the morning, correcting papers or preparing class, and then getting up at 6 to try to, walk the dog and get those children off to school. Where do you even write? I remember I have such intense memories that maybe the mothers watching this show, perhaps the fathers too, will have some version of. For instance, one of the places I could try to write a poem was when I was doing the laundry. So I'd take a big basket of laundry down to the cellar, leaving the children upstairs and their father and the dog or whatever. And I could have 10 minutes, say, in the dark, in the basement, sitting on the floor with my back to the washing machine and my little pad, and the washing machine still going behind me and scribbling in the pad. I just remember those were my laundry days. Or driving to BU and parking in the parking lot, and before rushing in to teach, give myself 10 minutes in the car, resting the pad on the steering wheel. I mean, I have these memories so intensely because there were times when that was all I could get.
And I think that's so important to share. Thank you for sharing that, because I feel like, particularly when we talk to writers who are very successful and have a lot of work that they can show for their career, it's hard to remember that that work wasn't written all at once or even at a desk. And I think there's that perception of sitting at a desk behind a closed door, working from like 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. or whatever it is. And so many women I've spoken to have said, much like you did, that they write or did write when their kids were younger, in the laundry room or in the car or while on a walk composing a poem or something. And it's like those carved out spaces. And can you talk a little bit about how you clearly got a lot accomplished in those carved out spaces, but maybe not all at one time. You didn't maybe write an entire book in the laundry room during one sitting.
No. But I also, I was also lucky in that I got some leaves from Boston University. I'm very grateful to Boston University for so many reasons. For one thing, they took a chance on me when I was young, and I don't have a PhD. So they really took a chance on this young whippersnapper would-be writer and gave me a chance to see if I could teach and be useful. And I tried to be useful, but also write books. So, yeah, I forget where we were, what we were talking.
Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
writing, right, sort of building a work in
That's right.
stolen
Well, I
moments.
had
Like,
leaves. I was saying I
yeah.
was grateful to BU for giving me leaves. I mean, they
Mhm.
didn't give me a lot of leaves, but and I'm very grateful I got some grants. I mean, you mentioned the Guggenheim, which was, and the ACLS, the American Council of Learned Societies. Those were just absolutely blessed opportunities to buy me out for my teaching time for a year or a half year. And the Guggenheim was 1985, and that too was life-changing. I was trying to write a biography of the French poet Max Jacob. The book that I started on the Guggenheim in 1985 just came out this year in 2020. If that gives anybody courage to keep on.
I think it should. It gives me courage.
And I dragged a 6-month-old baby and a 2-year-old to Paris on a Guggenheim, which is not, it's prestige, but it's not much money. I lived in a dark hole next to the Bibliothèque Nationale, and I had with me a very, very wonderful ex-BU student, sort of au pair, who was sharing our difficulties, and on a tiny little stipend and the chance to be in Paris. And she took care of the kids for 4 hours a day while I ran to the library or did interviews and then rushed back so she could go off and do whatever she wanted in Paris. So we were a little commune, and the children were part of it. So I think it's insane when I look back at what I did, dragging a baby and a toddler to Paris. But we all survived, and the book came out in 2020, for God's sake.
It's amazing. Congratulations. And Nicole says congratulations too here in the chat. So
Thank you, Nicole.
Yeah, and we have a couple more comments, and then we'll come back to a few more questions. But Heather Liz says, I find children tend to accept absent fathers who are not around or shutting the door for their work. My own various age children still hold a double standard for me and my writing versus my spouse. Did you find that? Now, tell us a little bit about your spouse and what that working relationship was like. I've heard various, all across the spectrum of spouses who say, I don't support your writing. It's something you've got to figure out for yourself. And spouses who say, this is important to you, we'll figure out how to make it work. Where does yours fall in there?
Well, I should say I'm now divorced, but not because of that. And we had a very good marriage for many, many years. And my spouse was also a professor at Boston University in classics. And we were both harried, exhausted, passionate teacher, writer, scholars. And I felt we were really in it together, supporting each other. So that was great. That was great. There was was not a problem.
That's great. Yeah. And I hear Heather saying, which I wonder about myself someday when my daughter's old enough to voice this, about children and their perspectives on their mothers or their fathers' absences. Yeah, and Heather adds, it's infuriating to know that my shut door hurts more than all the hours my spouse is gone engaged in work. So I wonder that about my own daughter. Will she weigh my absences more heavily than the time that my husband maybe goes to his job? Have you found, and without getting too much into your children's personal lives, which I know we don't want to do, but have you found that your children have given you sort of feedback, I guess, about the time that you spent writing?
Find your daughter gives you plenty of feedback, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, but my elder daughter is now a mother of 2 young children, and she's a very hardworking lawyer, and they're experiencing the same kind of stresses, she and her husband, and being professional people and having very young, needy children, and especially during a pandemic year when this has been so awful especially for women this year, and mothers dealing with children at home. I don't have to just quote all the New York Times articles we all know, but it's been a dreadful year for families under super stress. I mean, you and I are talking now about normal stresses, which are hard enough, but add a pandemic.
Yeah.
So what are children going to give feedback? Inevitably they will. Yeah. I just hope, to go back to the wounded snake and that poem that I read at the beginning for Kiara, I just hope in any family that there's enough basic trust and enough basic structure of caring that the children, what they fundamentally feel is they're loved.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the fundamental strength any person needs to get through life. And so I just have to trust that that's going to sustain us through our difficulties.
I think that's a great point. It's something I struggle with personally, is particularly during the pandemic when my daughter hasn't been in school for a year. And I was telling you before the interview that my parents live now 15, 20 minutes away. So they've been watching her during the week so I can do my day job and try to fit in the writing around the laundry, like you described.
Yeah.
But she is loved and she feels no lack there, but there's still the sense, for me at least, or the guilt of not being the one who is doing the loving during the majority of the day.
Yes.
So I think that's a very good point to bring up, that as long as the child feels loved, and it doesn't necessarily need to be by the mother actively all the time, right? It could be from others who love your child.
Yeah. And that the mother's time and the father's time when they're there is good time that is really engaged. Yeah. I think having children, for me, I mean, there's so many marvelous things to say about having children. One of my revelations about it was that you're no longer the center of the world. Mm-hmm. That was important lesson. I don't know if I was megalomaniacal before having a child, but I really, having a child, you realize you are not the center of the world anymore. Your life is completely, your whole cosmology has changed. You've got your fundamental imperatives to care for somebody else. That's amazing. And that's carried through the whole rest of my life as this profound lesson. And the other thing that I feel from, among many things, from having children and now watching my grandchildren, is the mystery of personhood. There's this extraordinary miracle that a creature has come into the world who is growing into be a person that you couldn't have predicted anything about this person. And just watching a seed turn into a little sprout and then grow leaves and grow up into the sun. It's astonishing. I do feel it as miraculous. I'm in awe.
Absolutely.
And then we become, the whole rest of our lives, I think of us as struggling to become people, whole people. I think it's probably not ended till we're in our graves. But you really see it in a young child, in a baby, and then in a young child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How did that work its way into your work? I'm sure it did. This sort of watching of a person unfold. How did that find its way into your poetry?
Oh, I'm not sure I could even say, because it happens at so many levels. It's not something I ever addressed explicitly in poems, but maybe it's a sensibility of that feeling of approaching life with awe. And as much watching a bear, but we're way off in the woods here. I've been in COVID-19 retreat in a cabin in the Catskills for now an entire year. And we have black bears around here. And so watching the bears this summer and fall, I watch them too. They're not people, but they're beings, they're creatures with very strong imperatives to live their own lives. I watch them with as much awe as I watch my fellow human beings, or try to watch my fellow human beings.
Absolutely. How did the realization that you weren't at the center of the world, and that now you're the center of your world, shifted to keeping this other person essentially alive and helping them, develop and grow? How did that change your work? And that's a slightly different question,
Yes.
but similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure how to answer, except maybe it has to do with noticing of what is your field of vision. What are you caring about in the poem? What are you seeing? What's the poem's crisis or trouble? For me, poems are, because I never even quote intended to write poems or be a writer, as I said. The poems have to have an urgency. They have a demand, a problem to solve, and some kind of trouble is the germ of a poem for me. And the trouble is often not about me, the writer, so much as something outside me in the world in relation to the consciousness that is perceiving. I don't know if I'm getting a little abstract here.
That's okay. Yeah. No, it makes sense.
But not being the center of the world is about a problem in vision. It's almost a problem in optics. Where are you standing? Who's perceiving what? What is the material of the poem? What is going to give it the urgency? What is going to give it the trouble?
This is probably a mean question, but is there a poem that you wrote before you became a mother that if you were to rewrite it or to write it now as a mother, that the sort of the optics would shift? Could you give us an example of like?
Wow, that is hard because it's a long time ago. Yes. But again, hard to say. But I guess some of the poems of romantic distress or erotic distress of young womanhood, where the wounded self is at the heart of things, the wounded, angry self, the vengeful self, the whatever. Those poems are, it's not that they're less interesting to me. They have their own kind of energy. And I think I honor that energy, that young woman energy of erotic drama.
Definitely.
But I wouldn't, I mean, partly it's just getting older, but also getting older and having children and grandchildren and a different experience of life, as one inevitably does getting older. That's no longer the drama that interests me now to write about myself. I'm interested in reading those poems written by whoever's writing them.
Yeah, and I'm interested how that ties back. And we have a few questions that I'll ask you in a second from listeners. So thank you all, and please keep them coming. But can we go back for a second to you as a young woman in high school, hating those dances and just resisting sort of that idea of girlhood? Because I connect with you so much there, and just I resisted sort of that girlhood so much that at times I tried to have some of my male friends called me by a boy's name so that so they would, accept me as one of their group rather than perceive me as a girl and all of the sort of weaknesses I perceived as coming along with that. So that resonated with me. Tell me just a little bit more about young Rosanna Warren, about 13-year-old Rosanna. What were you like at that age?
Oh, and probably insufferable. We're just reading, Dostoevsky and drawing all day and shy and getting along better with my dog than with kids my age. But I have I'm looking at a poem here that I published a few years ago called Away. It was originally published in Poetry Magazine, and now it's in my book, So Forth. And I'll just read a few lines. It has a scene from when I was in my very early 20s, probably still in college, a summer in Paris in a painting and in a painting program, and meeting some guy on the street. And it's about this kind of Halloween drama of gender roles.
Yes, please.
And it has I won't read the whole poem. It has an epigraph from a pop singer, Marianne Faithfull, who, had her early incarnation was singing in a very sweet little girl voice. And then when she had a period of terrible drug addiction and living on the street, her voice got rough and kind of really interesting. Anyway, away. The whole trick of this thing is to get out of your own light, Marianne Faithfull. She said she sang very close to the mic to change the space. And I changed the space by striding down the Boulevard Raspail at dusk in tight jeans until an Algerian engineer plucked the pen from my back pocket. As if you're inside my head and you're hearing the song from in there. He came from the desert. I came from green suburbs. We understood nothing of one another over glasses of metallic red wine. I was playing girl. He played man. Several plots were afoot, all misfiring. That's the beginning of the poem. So I maybe it's an oblique way of responding to your question, but it is, I guess, every one of us, whatever gender we are or want to be or find our way to, I imagine as humans, we're fumbling to become whole people of the kind of wholeness that we imagine for ourselves, and which could be a whole range of different imaginations. And we're trying to find circumstances in which we're allowed to do that. And so I feel it's kind of an extraordinary time now where there are more, in some cultures and societies, more freedom to experiment with those roles and find ways to be comfortable in one's body that there weren't, for instance, mostly in the 1950s when I was born.
Yeah. You talk a little bit about how, well, if you agree, maybe you don't, how poetry might be a place to play with or try on some of those different roles in exploration of yourself.
Oh, I love that question. Yes, exactly. It's a theater of possibilities, poetry. It is where we experiment with consciousness, and where we can take all kinds of imaginative and emotional risks, because finally, as I often say, you're doing it in the privacy of your study, and you're not hurting anybody, at least until you publish.
Yeah. Actually, this leads us. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking that maybe that's, in a larger sense, why we need art. It is the symbolic realm. Think of Greek tragedy. It's the realm where the Athenians could gather for 4 days in a year and play out their worst nightmares, and in their comedies, their hysterical, obscene desires and wit and humor, those other tensions that would otherwise might blow up a society.
That's amazing. Yeah, you sort of blew the question right out of my head, actually. I have to try to remember what it was. Oh, it was about publishing. And this will tie back to a question that Heather Liz has for you. But let's talk first about what happens to your poetry or to that playfulness once it moves from your own office to a book that someone else is holding.
Well, you don't control it anymore, right? It's out of your hands. And it becomes impersonal, however personal it felt when you crafted this object. If it's an object, a kind of art, becomes an object when it's exteriorized. So I don't know what else to say except that I am fascinated by the way the personal is metamorphosed. It's almost an alchemy into something that becomes an art object. And whatever fiction of personality is in the artwork, it is outside yourself. And now, of course, with all the social media, all these ways that people can publish their images and their writing, we're in a sense in a culture that's increasingly saturated with expressiveness. So it's kind of glorious. So many forms that expressiveness takes.
I love that. And actually, here's a question again from Heather. She has some great questions here. Speaking of the form in which the form that a poem takes, have you found the pandemic changing the form of your poetry at all? And Heather says that for her, I'm sorry, that was Nicole has this question for you. Nicole's finding that she's gravitating to small, compact forms for reasons of, that are kind of obvious. More compact time or your attention being divided in lots of different places.
Yes. I've been writing a lot in this retreat up in the mountains this year. We came here on March 14th, 2020, escaping, having no idea we'd be here a year later. It was like so many people. And I found that more than the pandemic, it was the politics of this year that so terrified me, and a strange bifocal vision of being peacefully in our cabin and seeing no other human beings except for once a month going out to get groceries and basically living on beans and rice and tinned fish, because we were being really super careful. And the outside world politically feeling that our democracy was under severe threat in ways I could not have. It just shows how naive I was. I could not have imagined earlier in my life that we would have this kind of threat of a militant, oligarchical revolution and takeover, destruction of our democracy and suppression of the vote. So that affected my writing. It certainly did. I was trying to find ways to figure out how to put that horror, that fear, that anger into the shapes that would be honorable poems. And each new poem is a new struggle. But it certainly put enormous pressure. Besides doing the modest political activism that you can do if you're an older person in retreat, which is, writing a lot of postcards and doing, support the vote efforts that way around the country. Anyway, I'm just, so the pandemic was bad enough, but the politics for me it continued to be terrifying, I have to say, about what has been revealed about our country and its divisions and the fragility of our institutions. So I'm now got up on a soapbox, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to start giving a speech, but it does affect. I think it affects artists in different ways, but how can it not affect our vision and our forms?
Absolutely. Yeah. Have you seen any patterns in the forms that your poems have taken in the last year? Have they, and maybe it's sort of a rudimentary question, but have they gotten sort of shorter, or are you sort of on a soapbox and they feel bigger? Like what's the scope of the poetry you've been writing for the last year?
Oh, well, I don't want to be on a soapbox for poems. That's not a good place for a poem to be. So that's part of the discipline. That's part of the aesthetic challenge, is how to put political anger and angst into a poem and yet still have it be a poem that works as a poem. They haven't gotten longer or shorter, but they've gotten urgent in a certain way, that So there's one that's coming out shortly on the website Poem a Day that is called Bolitas, which is the name of a mushroom. And you'd think it would be a poem about mushrooms, but it's a poem about being poisoned.
Wow.
And violence seen through nature. So, I mean, that's part of the way I work is to try to get at questions obliquely. Because for one thing, I would like my poems to be meaningful in 25 or 50 years, not just in 2021.
Yeah, definitely. Which actually leads to another question. This one from Heather Liz. How do you know when a poem is finished?
Oh, that's an eternal question.
We laugh. Yeah.
Yes. I think the French poet Paul Valéry said a poem is never finished. You just give up. But well, that's a really good, serious question. I don't necessarily know. So I stick my drafts into what I call a compost heap, and I let them sit there for a while, decomposing or stinking or doing what things do in a compost heap, and then look at it a few weeks later and see it how it looks to me then, and then stick it back and then look again. And if after some of this compost heap process it still seems to hold together, then I would send it out to a magazine and see if any editor wants it. And so they might not, or they might.
That's great.
So it's and giving public readings is another kind of test, but it's not for me a really good test, because you can not exactly fake a reading, but you can give an emotional, dramatic performance of a poem, and it gives you the illusion that it might be a good poem. It could even give the audience the illusion. But then when in the cold light of day looking at it on paper, you might say, no, that's a cheap move, or that's fake something. Anyway, so it just takes a lot of self-criticism and vigilance, which is why I like the question.
Yeah, definitely. I love the compost metaphor. That's amazing. I'm going to have to use that when I think about my own work. I also love the articulation of how a performance can sort of imbue work with maybe like a glimmer of something that it doesn't inherently possess, or that it doesn't have yet. So could you talk a little bit more about, and then we'll get back to motherhood and writerhood in a second, but about poetry as sort of spoken performance, and poetry as in the cold light of day if you're holding it on the page and reading it that way, experiencing it that way.
Well, both are really important to me. I do love performing poems, other people's as well as my own. And I like to think of poetry as originating in music and song. And as you probably remember from our classes together, I mean, I used to translate ancient Greek lyric poetry, Sappho, Archilochus, Alcaios. These poets really matter. They were performers. This was no separation then in the 7th and 6th century before the Common Era of musical performance, of singing and dance, and occasionally accompanied by an instrument, by a flute or a stringed instrument. So by the time that performative convention gets lost by the time even you get to Roman poetry, which I also love, Horace and Catullus and Virgil and Ovid. That's more text-based, but it remembers the lyrical Greek conventions. All of which is background. This is in my mind because I've translated those Greek poets. I've translated the Latin poets. They're in my mind as a model. I have a lot of poems memorized, English poems and French poems that I chant to myself. And so when I give a poetry reading of my own work, I do really love the performance. I throw myself into it. I feel, if it's good, if it's working, I feel possessed. It's a kind of trance-like state even. but I'm also aware of the dangers. I am aware that of the possibility of deluding myself. So it's just a matter of just trying, as I say, to stay vigilant. Then the critical mind is also part of creating poetry.
Yeah. I love that. I never thought about that before, about the performative I mean, I've thought about, reciting or reading poetry, but not that the performative part might take over from the, I don't know, the non-performative part. So that's really interesting to hear.
Well, I think it's important to honor them both.
Mm-hmm.
And especially now with the sort of the world of spoken word poetry and young people having this marvelous forum for memorizing and performing. This is terrific. It's almost like bringing back ancient Greece.
That's lovely. Social media has returned to ancient Greece. Let's completely switch tacks for a second here and talk about grandkids. How is the experience of watching your grandchildren grow up different than raising your own children? What's it like to be a grandmother?
Oh, well, it's delicious. Though this year of the pandemic has been hard since I haven't seen them in person since last July. And so we do Zoom games, but that's not as satisfying, but it's better than nothing. I think I'll just repeat myself and just talk about the awe of seeing a person grow into a person. My granddaughter Adelaide, who just turned 6, when she was about 3, I just remember I was amazed because she was so small. I was going to visit there and take her for a walk or something, and she saw it was summer, so I was wearing sandals, and she saw I had a Band-Aid on one of my toes, and she got really worried, and she said, Grandma Zana, you have a boo-boo. You have a boo-boo on your toe. Does it hurt? This tiny child was really concerned that somebody else might be hurt. And so I had to say, oh, it's okay. It doesn't really hurt that badly. I just give this an example of the miracle of personhood and of the child already developing empathy and awareness of other people have lives and they have feelings too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Have you learned anything from your grandchildren that surprised you? I know my own parents, who have been spending a lot of time with my 4.5-year-old, I'm not sure it's that they've learned new things, but they're remembering things that they'd forgotten about having young people around, very small children. Are you finding the same?
Oh, yes, though I don't have the luck of your parents of having grandchildren with me so most of the week.
All the time.
It's hard to say. It's partly the inventiveness. So one of the glories of being a grandparent for me is rereading all those books that I loved as a child, and I love reading with my children when they were little. So Winnie the Pooh and the Wind in the Willows and Just So stories and all these rediscovering all these stories and having the children be just as absorbed in them as I was, and we can be re-inhabit all these worlds together. But the children are also making up their own worlds and inventing games and inventing characters, and watching my Lachlan, who's 3 years old, and Adelaide, who's 6, they can play by themselves, talking to themselves and making their toys talk and make a whole imaginative world without any grown-up interfering and saying, why don't you do this or why don't you do that? And that just seems so precious, and probably the beginning of where human culture starts is this freedom to imagine and to make shapes and to act out dramas.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. I actually really admire that in my daughter, because I have lost my ability to do that, as I think most adults do at a certain point. Your ability to just kind of be absorbed in your own play without worrying about any outcomes or productivity or anything like that. And I find it both invigorating, but also really challenging to kind of sit quietly with her and play with like blocks or Legos or something, because I'm always reminding myself that I have to be there in the moment with her and I shouldn't be thinking about work or this thing over here that I should be doing. Um, is that and I find that my parents have a lot more capacity to do that with her than I do now. So I don't know if it's like the life stage that we're in, different life stages or what, but um, what about you? That's not really a question. It's just sort of more of a, where do you fall there? Are you able to kind of, when you get to see your grandkids, to really just be absorbed in their play? Were you able to as a mother early on, or were you distracted by all of the intellectual things that you had in your brain?
Well, I was distracted possibly by intellectual things, but also, as happens in many families, my own parents were getting seriously ill and dying when my children were young. So I was squeezed with having to take care of elderly, suffering people and very young children and teach. Yeah. Anyway, so I was certainly distracted. Yeah. That is yes. Reading aloud was always a very big part of our family life, from my husband and myself and our children, reading with them every night and having supper together and talking, trying, no matter what was going on, to try to have some core to family life. So they would grow up with that, with all the other emergencies that were around us. I'm looking at my notes here because I wrote down something that I learned as a parent, not when the children were small, but as they were getting to be teenagers. And was one of the most painful things was that there were things happening in my children's lives that I couldn't fix. And when they're little and they skin their knee, you can bring out the mercurochrome and the Band-Aid and the magic words and the hugs, and later, then inevitably life is going to hurt them in some ways, and some ways that you mom cannot fix. And having to respect boundaries in that way and learn to step back. I guess my answer comes from your question about stepping back and letting them play freely, which I also think is really important, to let them play and make up their own games. There's so much directive parenting these days. I think it's important to let children figure out their own games, partly. But then when there are certain kinds of troubles they're going to get into, that was maybe the hardest thing for me as a parent, is understanding there were certain things I could not fix. And then figuring out, well, what can you do? And maybe you can just try to be somehow present without being pushy. It's hard. Yeah. I can tell you, I haven't totally figured it out yet.
Let me know if you do, but I think that's probably just true across all mothers and writer mothers. And I think the acknowledgement that we're still figuring it out is a good place to end on the hour. So thank you, Rosanna.
Thank you, Lara, so much. It's just been fascinating to think
really
about
fun.
These things out loud.
Absolutely. Please stick around for a second after so I could say goodbye, but I'm going to pull you down and just say thank you. It's been such a pleasure. And take a look while I'm wrapping up at the comments here from former students and from other writers who've all sort of chimed in with questions and solidarity and just enthusiasm for this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing us. Thank you, Lara. Bye.
You. And thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation and for your great comments and questions. Special hello and thank you to uni friends who I know love and are excited to see Rosanna as much as I do and was. So thank you all again for chiming in. Come back next week. And as always, you can watch this video again on Facebook, YouTube, and on writermothermonster.com. Soon we'll also have the audio available and the transcript. So check back again, and I will see you all next week.